Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. We're going to return to ancient Rome tonight. In this episode, I'm going to tell you the story of Rome from the last years of the Republic to the end of the Western Roman Empire. This is the second part of a two-part story. You will find part one in my library, but you don't need to listen to part one to understand what follows. So we have a lot to discuss tonight. From the rise of Julius Caesar to the golden age of the Roman Empire, until its partial collapse. The last centuries of Rome may be the most important ones when it comes to Roman heritage, because it is through this long-lasting presence in Europe and in the Middle East that Roman laws, science, architecture, and culture were passed to other civilizations. It is also through the structure of the Roman Empire that Christianity spread widely. The events, the episodes I will tell you about tonight include the conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar, the tragedy of Cleopatra and how she died with the independence of her country, Egypt, the persecution of early Christians, Nero, and barbarian invasions. But first, allow me a few seconds of your time to tell you about our Patreon page, which allows you to directly support the channel financially with as little as $3.50 a month. But even if all you wish to or can pledge is this amount, you will receive all of what we offer, because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. This contribution comes with perks, of course, like all the episodes with and without background sounds, the possibility to download them all and listen offline, communicate directly with us and our community, and monthly exclusive episodes only available on Patreon. Thank you in advance for considering joining our Patreon. This keeps us going. You will find links to Patreon along with links to several streaming apps in the episode's description. Now, before we start our journey together, if you feel comfortable doing so, you might want to gently close your eyes and let any concerns or stress simply drift away. Find yourself a position that feels truly comfortable, perhaps shifting slightly until you feel perfectly settled. Draw in a slow, deep breath that fills your lungs completely. And as you gradually release that breath, notice how your shoulders naturally drop. Feel the tightness melting away from your neck. Allow your facial features to soften and your jaw to become loose and comfortable. Ensure your hands are naturally opened and relaxed. Let your legs rest peacefully without any strain, and permit the gentle rhythm of my words to accompany you on this peaceful adventure. And now we are ready to begin our discovery. Let's now return to where we left last time in the 1st century BC. So we ended our story of the Roman Republic in the middle of the 1st century. The Roman Republic was already very ancient by then. It had been founded by the end of the 6th century BC and had already gone through many hardships to stabilize its institutions, conquer Italy, defeat Carthage, and expand all around the Mediterranean Sea. By the middle of the 1st century BC, Rome had become a dominant power, and it already occupied Spain, the south of Gaul, Italy, Greece, and parts of North Africa and the Middle East. Rome was wealthy, technologically advanced, and had the largest and most powerful army in the known world. But the regime, the institutions, the republic looked increasingly fragile and threatened. You remember that the republic was based on a balance of power in the city of Rome between social classes. There was an elite, the patricians, who controlled the Senate, and the rest of the citizens forming the plebs. After several centuries, these institutions were very respected, and Romans were culturally very suspicious of individuals trying to seize power for themselves. In Rome, political authority was not concentrated on individual figures. There were 2 consuls. They were re-elected every year. But even though the republican system had been very resilient for a long time, it looked increasingly weak in the 1st century. Politics had become more violent, with the Senate or the plebs willing to use violence and assassination to impose their views. Throughout recent decades, numerous powerful military leaders had emerged, with various political factions viewing them as instruments to enforce their agenda, including generals Marius and Sulla, and most recently Pompey. While senators and plebeian tribunes fully understood the institutional dangers such arrangements posed, they remained unable to resist exploiting these relationships when it advanced their own political objectives. During the 70s BC, the strong man of the moment was Pompey. He had served the Republic and Rome very well by pacifying Spain, organizing the elimination of pirates in the Mediterranean Sea, and his role in completing the suppression of Spartacus's slave rebellion, and even sailed to the Levant to conquer more provinces for Rome. When Pompey returned from the East after 5 years, his military glory and authority were unmatched, and these were the best pathways to power and influence in Rome. But many senators were worried about what he could do with this influence, and they turned hostile. So Pompey allied with the 2 men who had risen in his absence, Crassus and Caesar. The 3 of them were given full powers for several years. They shared power between them, which was more acceptable in Rome because of the republican traditions, and their unofficial alliance is called the Triumvirate. This is where we stopped at the end of part 1. Neither of the 3 were inclined to share power forever, and they tried to use the years they had ahead of them to strengthen their positions. Crassus was initially the political patron of Caesar. He had amassed a considerable fortune and was even called the richest man of Rome, and had been elected tribune of the plebs. Crassus and Pompey hated each other, and the alliance was constantly unstable. Actually, it lasted for a few years only. Crassus received the governorship of the province of Syria and intended to use it as a launchpad to conquer more land for Rome and gain the military glory that he lacked. So he launched an expedition against the Parthian Empire, Rome's neighbor in Syria. But the expedition was a complete disaster, and he ended up losing his army and being killed in 53 BC. Caesar also lacked the aura of military success that Pompey had, and he knew he needed to acquire this when the Triumvirate was formed. But who was Julius Caesar? He came from a patrician family, the gens Julia. Gens, you remember, is a Latin name for these ancient Roman families, and Caesar had become the master of the family early at 16, following his father's death. At a young age, he started a political career and took on responsibilities in the years before the formation of the Triumvirate. He made a political alliance with Crassus, and the two men never betrayed each other. They remained allies until Crassus's death. But before that, Caesar had had a very eventful life with ups and downs. He had lost his family fortune because he was on the wrong side when Sulla became dictator, and he had been stripped of his inheritance, and he had to go into hiding for several years away from Rome. He served in the military and returned to Rome later, starting again from scratch. Despite being from a patrician family, he rose inside the People's Party, the plebs' party, as a politician with talent, as an orator, and from this period he was in the same circle as Crassus. After having lost almost everything, he made his way back to the top politically like this, and was even elected consul. Caesar was extraordinarily ambitious, and he understood perfectly the institutions and the balance of power in Rome. He grew up in a period when political life was violent, and the Senate, or the plebs, were more than ready to use armies to crush the other faction if need be. And he understood, like Crassus, that the only way to have legitimacy in Rome and gain popular support was through a demonstration of strength through military victories. So that when the Triumvirate began, his goal became to conquer land for the Republic and bolster his own position by doing so. Caesar's target would be Gaul. Why Gaul? He had received direct command of provinces in the south of France that had been Roman for decades already, and Gaul was a strategic target for Rome. First, because it was very populated and could turn into a wealthy province if well exploited. It is hard to know how many inhabitants there were, but estimates point to around 10 million, which was as much as Italy. The land was fertile, and the climate was mild, so this land was rather welcoming, hence the high population. And Gaul was also a threat to Rome, because it was close to Italy, and it needed to be secured. The Romans had not forgotten the Gallic invasion from the 4th century BC, when Rome was occupied and ransomed by Brennus. And Gaul was also very fragmented. It was an area with a common Celtic culture, but multiple tribes, around 60, that were often at war among them. And this lack of coordination was a perfect opportunity to face them separately and even ally with some of them. Like other Celtic people in Western Europe, the Gauls did not have the type of technological and administrative sophistication that the Romans had. But they were not backwards either. They had cities, some of them of a significant size, and their weaponry was on a par with the Romans almost. In particular, their metallurgy was as good as Rome's. In 58 BC, Caesar answered the call for help from a tribe against another and began a long campaign that would end a few years later in the subjugation of all Gaul. The Romans quickly moved north and took control of the northeast of Gaul, a region called Belgica. From this position, they pushed towards the southwest. From 53 BC, the growing Roman presence united several tribes, and they rose against Rome and accepted a common chief to lead their campaign against the invading power. The chief was called Vercingetorix, and he was the chief of the Auvergnes, a tribe from central Gaul. In 52 BC, Vercingetorix led a large army that defeated Caesar's 6 legions at the Battle of Gergovia, which was a huge setback for Rome, but only a temporary one, because the same year Caesar managed to circle and besiege Vercingetorix and the Gallic army inside the city of Alesia. This is in Burgundy today. The defenders starved inside the city and finally had to surrender. Vercingetorix was made prisoner and then sent to Rome to be paraded in Caesar's triumph, and then he was strangled in jail. After that, over the following years, Gaul was pacified and turned into a new province of the Republic. In terms of area and population, this was Rome's biggest conquest to date outside of Italy, and Caesar had now gained a kind of aura and popularity that could put him on par with Pompey. Crassus had died in the east in his doomed war against the Parthian Empire, and the Triumvirate had ceased to exist with the death of Crassus. Pompey worried about Caesar, and so did the Senate. Even though Caesar was from a prestigious patrician family, he had risen to power inside the People's Party, whereas Pompey was closer to the Senate. So the senators named Pompey the only consul, and as Caesar was on his way back to Italy, they ordered him to disband his army. Caesar refused, and instead marched on Rome with it. This is when he would have said, Alea iacta est, the die is cast. And this is an anecdote that was probably made up later, but it reflects how Caesar knew that defying the Senate and Pompey could only have two outcomes, victory or death. And this Latin phrase, alea iacta est, the die is cast, remained as a way to say that events have passed the point of no return. There is another phrase, crossing the Rubicon. The Rubicon was a river in northern Italy, which means about the same. Crossing the Rubicon means one has decided, voluntarily, to pass a point of no return. So crossing the Rubicon marked the beginning of a civil war between supporters of Caesar and supporters of Pompey. The civil war began in 49 BC. Caesar reached Rome and entered the city without difficulty. Pompey and many senators had already escaped to Macedonia to regroup and raise an army. Caesar crossed the Adriatic Sea, and they met at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. This was a decisive victory for Caesar, despite his smaller army. Pompey escaped to Egypt and Caesar followed him. But when Caesar reached Egypt, King Ptolemy XIII had already ordered the assassination of Pompey and sent his head to Caesar. Egypt at the time was still an independent country with a Greek dynasty, the Ptolemies. This was an attempt to gain the new master of Rome's favors, but it completely backfired for Ptolemy. Instead of gaining a grateful friend, he made an enemy. Caesar was first and foremost a politician, and his goal was more to consolidate power than seek revenge against Pompey. Showing mercy and uniting factions was the best way to appear above everyone else and secure in his power, which is why he forgave many senators and other supporters of Pompey and even gave them back their positions. Caesar was hoping he could do the same with Pompey himself, which would have been a fantastic public relations operation for him. But by trying to gain his favors, Ptolemy XIII stole this opportunity from him. In Egypt, Caesar met Cleopatra. She was fighting against her brother Ptolemy to become the sole ruler of the country, and Caesar started a relationship with her and helped her secure the throne. So because Pompey had been assassinated before Caesar would convince him to accept defeat and become loyal, he had to keep fighting against the remains of Pompey's family and supporters in the following years. From Egypt, Caesar also kept campaigning in Asia. What we call Asia here is Asia as it was defined by the Greeks and the Romans. Asia began in Turkey, and the world east of Mesopotamia was very mysterious to them. The Romans were perfectly aware that there were countries far away in the east. Alexander the Great had reached Central Asia and even India. And they also knew about China because already in antiquity there was the Silk Road that brought various products from the Far East by land, mainly through Central Asia and the Middle East. After changing hands many times, precious Chinese products and spices from Southeast Asia arrived in Rome. If you're interested, I have a story about the Silk Road in my library. So, returning to our story, by 46 BC, Caesar had finished pacifying the Republic's provinces, and this Republican empire was larger than ever. And in Rome, he had promoted himself to dictator for life. The Republic still existed, and so did its institutions. But in fact, a dictator for life is not that far from a king or an emperor. By gathering so much power in his hands, whereas there was no imminent threat that called for it, and without a time limit, Caesar was continuing the weakening of republican institutions, almost ruining them, and he could not know it, but he was paving the way towards the transformation of the republic into an empire governed by a single person. Maybe that was inevitable back then. Long before Caesar, the functioning of institutions had started to deteriorate and had turned more and more violent. Several civil wars had taken place in less than a century, and because of Rome's size, with all these new provinces far away, maybe the kind of republic that worked well when the territory was smaller was now doomed. We'll never know. But maybe the alternative to Julius Caesar and his successors taking charge of all power could have been the explosion of Rome, which now extended from modern Spain in the west to Syria in the east, and from Belgium to Libya. What is undeniable, anyway, is that the transformation of the Republic into an empire that we are going to discuss opened a more peaceful period inside the frontiers of Rome, at least at the beginning. It almost put an end to the vicious circle of faction fights in the city of Rome, leading to civil wars in Italy and beyond. But Caesar would not be the one to put an end to the Republic. He still had opponents within Rome, motivated by their own ambitions and also a willingness to preserve the Republic. He also had opponents to his politics, especially in the ruling and wealthier classes, because as a dictator he instituted in large part the People's Party's program. He limited the senator's power. He distributed land to war veterans and poor people. It would be completely anachronistic, but if we had to position Caesar's policy on a left-right political axis, as we do today, Caesar's policy would have been firmly on the left side, and this didn't please everyone. In 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated inside the Senate by a conspiracy, including his own adoptive son, Brutus. Caesar had chosen a successor, his nephew, Octavian, better known as Augustus, his future name as the first emperor of Rome. But when Caesar was killed, Rome was still a republic, and once again the struggle for power resumed immediately. 3 men allied to form a new triumvirate of military dictators. The 3 men were Octavian, the heir, and 2 consuls, Marcus Antonius, better known as Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus. The latter was a close ally to Caesar until his assassination. The three members of this new triumvirate shared between themselves the administration of provinces, like had been done before in the first triumvirate 20 years earlier. Octavian took the western provinces, including the city of Rome, Mark Antony the east, and Lepidus the south, with North Africa. Like Julius Caesar before him, Octavian was not inclined to share power, and his main rival was Mark Antony, who was now away from Rome. Octavian and his supporters were trying to discredit Mark Antony in Rome. They were helped when he started a relationship with Cleopatra in Egypt. This gave him an image of weakness in Rome for being in the arms of a foreign queen. And obviously Octavian supporters pushed this narrative. Back then, Egypt was under the influence of Rome, but it was still officially independent, and it was also a very strategic region in the Mediterranean world, because Rome needed grain from the Nile Valley. Italy alone did not produce enough to sustain its population, including the city of Rome itself. And like Gaul and Italy, the delta and valley of the Nile had a very large population. Ptolemaic Egypt was not a threat to Rome, but Egypt, allied with a consul controlling the eastern part of the Republic, could be a threat. And like the first triumvirate, the second one turned into a civil war. Octavian won it after a decisive battle at Actium in 31 BC. This is probably the largest naval battle of antiquity. It sealed Mark Antony's and Cleopatra's fate. They both committed suicide afterwards, and it ended the independence of Egypt that became a Roman province. Marcus Lepidus had also been forced into exile, leaving Octavian the only ruler of Rome. In 27 BC, he was made imperator, meaning commander by the Senate and people of Rome. By the way, this is the meaning of the initials SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, Senate and people of Rome, that together formed the government of the Republic. Later, Octavian was awarded the name Augustus, meaning the venerated. So officially the Republic was not abolished. Augustus was too smart to do that, and it remained in place for 3 more centuries, but only as a facade. Augustus emptied the Republic from its substance. The new imperators in the system he created would inherit their charge and rule for the rest of their lives, forming dynasties. This is why the year 27 BC, when Augustus was made emperor, is considered to be the end of the Republic and the beginning of the empire. But there was never any proclamation of it. Actually, Augustus just continued Caesar's work that had been interrupted by Caesar's assassination. The end of the Republic in all but name, and the complete victory of Augustus, opened a period of long-lasting stability, which is something that the Republic had never really enjoyed. Stability here means that no war within the frontiers of the European Empire took place. There were many conflicts on the frontiers to defend provinces and gain more, but the inside of the empire was kept safe for about 200 years. Transitions between emperors were rarely smooth. We're going to talk about that. But the empire was not hit by a large-scale civil war like before, until at least the end of the 2nd century AD. For these reasons, the beginning of the empire is also the beginning of the so-called Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a long period of stability that did a lot for the prosperity of each province, and that was still remembered as a golden age, centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire. So what does this prosperity mean exactly? Because, as always in history, we tend to focus on events, trends and people in power and how societies worked. But people had many other preoccupations in their daily lives. There were no statistics about income or standards of living, of course, but it is possible to estimate the relative wealth of regions, how the economy worked, and what was produced. The wealthiest region of the empire was very probably Italy, because it had the best infrastructures. It received taxes from other provinces, and it was the center of trade flows within the empire. It was followed by Roman Asia, which is to say Anatolia, Turkey, Egypt, and Gaul. The economy was obviously mainly agrarian, centered on agriculture, but mining and metallurgy enjoyed enormous developments in Roman provinces. The main mining regions of the empire were Spain, Gaul, and Anatolia. For some metals like lead, the Roman Empire had a visible impact on world production. We know it through the analysis of ice layers in Greenland. Old layers of ice keep the memory of what the atmosphere of the Earth was like several centuries or even several millennia ago. And the levels of lead pollution in the atmosphere rose dramatically in the 1st centuries AD. Then they collapsed, and they returned to the peak from the Roman era only in the 18th century, when the Industrial Revolution was burgeoning. The same for copper. Spain alone produced about 40% of world copper in this period. Iron production was estimated at 3 pounds per inhabitant per year. This is much more than in medieval Europe. Precious metals stayed within the frontiers of the empire. They circulated with trade between the provinces, but there was no major inflow or outflow of precious metals if you consider the entire Roman Empire. So thanks to mining, the stocks of gold and even more of silver rose dramatically. Later in the Middle Ages, precious metals became scarce in Europe because Europe was a net buyer of foreign products and needed to pay in precious metals. So again, it took more than a millennium and the discovery of the Americas for Europe to return to the kind of precious metal abundance that it enjoyed during the Roman Empire. There were also banks, and credit was available to traders. This was made possible by the monetization of the economy. Contrary to other ancient societies, people under the empire expressed the price of goods in money. Barter was no longer the normal way of doing trade. An abundance of Roman coins was created, and they are still relatively abundant in museums and private collections today. The state functioned by raising taxes on income, trade between provinces, and could finance the army and spectacular infrastructures, especially in Rome itself. The distribution of income and assets was very unequal. It is estimated that about 90% of people lived with the bare minimum, and we are just close to subsistence. Close to 10% of the population formed like a small middle class, often to be found in cities. And then you had 1 or 2% of the total population able to live in various levels of luxury. These are just vague estimates that reflect the inequality between social classes. These figures cannot be taken as hard data, but they give a fair image of what the social structure looked like during this period. Actually, the distribution of income was quite similar to what was observed in Europe and the Middle East until the Industrial Revolution began, and then a broader middle class appeared. There were big fortunes in some families. Some of them made a fortune out of banking by lending money and real estate. This is how Crassus from the first Triumvirate made his fortune. But as the empire declined in the 4th and 5th centuries, it became harder and harder to make these extremely wealthy families pay taxes and the state. The government became increasingly poor inside an otherwise wealthy empire. Some historians have blamed this absence of funding for being one of the reasons the Roman Empire was unable to defend itself against barbarian invasions. Let's not be simplistic, because there were other reasons too that we will discuss later. But maybe there's a lesson to ponder here. By refusing to give a little, the very wealthy of the Roman Empire may have lost everything, because the society their wealth was based on was destroyed. And there can be no fortune without a functioning government and society to make it work and protect it. Let's return to the reign of the first Emperor Augustus, because the fall of the empire is still quite far in the future. It was a long reign. He died apparently of natural causes in 14 AD. After 40 years, as Imperator Augustus did more than anyone else before or after him to expand the annexation of Egypt. He ordered the conquest of the rest of the Iberian Peninsula. Rome had been in Spain for a long time, already more than 200 years after the Second Punic War, but the entire peninsula had not been occupied before. And he also pushed the northern frontiers to the Rhine and the Danube. It did not go without difficulties, especially against the Germanic tribes. The Romans suffered one of their worst defeats ever against the Germans at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. 3 Roman legions were destroyed at once. The numbers of legions had been increasing to 50 during the Civil War against Mark Antony. After the war, it was reduced to 28. So 3 legions were about 10% of the entire Roman army. But still, despite a few setbacks and unrest in new provinces, the reign of Augustus was very successful at expanding Rome and strengthening the new regime. He died in 14 AD, seemingly of natural causes, at the age of 75. I say seemingly because we are going to see that natural death was uncommon among his successors. The empire may have been more stable, but power struggle remained the rule in Rome, and it was ruthless. Octavian, and later Augustus, remain a controversial figure in historiography. He was often disliked for his naked ambition first, his severity, and his termination of the Republic, even though in fact he just continued a trend that had started before him. Dictatorship existed from the early Republic, even though it was always time-limited and for a short time. In case of military emergency, the state would grant full powers to someone for a few months. Then the practice of dictatorship was revived with Sulla, and Caesar was the first to become dictator for life. Augustus was not technically a dictator, but the result was close. He concentrated a lot of power in his hands, but in a sense, Caesar did at least as much as him to undermine the Republic. Maybe more than anything, some people disliked Augustus for his cold and ambitious behavior. More often than not, stories are told from the point of view of his opponents. For example, stories about Cleopatra are always told from the point of view of Mark Antony and her, not Augustus. But there is no denying he was maybe the single most important ruler in the history of Rome for his conquests, his transformation of institutions, and the duration of his rule. The new system designed by Augustus made the succession between emperors hereditary, but he outlived several of his possible successors, and the charge was passed to his stepson Tiberius. The following rulers, including Tiberius, formed the so-called Julio-Claudian dynasty. What does this mean? Augustus, like Julius Caesar, belonged to the Julia-Patrician family, the gens Julia. He is a stepson. Tiberius was from the gens Claudia, and until 68 AD, emperors came from both families, hence the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Another thing that can be confusing is the title Caesar. Initially, it is a name, the name of Julius Caesar, but it became a title claimed by successive emperors that would be called Caesar. The direct successors of Augustus pale in comparison. After a few years, Tiberius became increasingly paranoid and ordered executions to get rid of anyone who could possibly have plotted against him. When he died, most of the people who could have succeeded him had been killed, and it fell on his grandnephew, Gaius, better known as Caligula. Caligula means literally little boots, but the name has become a symbol of madness, according to accounts, but they have to be taken cautiously. He once appointed his favorite horse to the Senate, and there are more stories of the same type. Caligula's reign was short. It lasted 4 years only, until he was assassinated by the commander of his guard, and his successor was Claudius. After the death of Caligula, the empire could actually have been terminated, and the republic reinstalled. The Senate discussed it. But the Praetorian Guard acclaimed Claudius as emperor, and the empire lasted thanks to this. The Praetorian Guard was a special guard created recently by Augustus, so when these events happened, it was this that was directly protecting the emperor and maintaining order in the city of Rome. So Claudius became the new emperor and proved more functional than his two predecessors. At least he was not paranoid or insane. He continued the empire's expansion, ordering in particular the conquest of Great Britain in 43 AD. Great Britain was never entirely controlled. The Romans went up north, about to where the modern separation between England and Scotland is today. Claudius's family life and succession have been the subject of many theories, novels, and dramatic works because he could have been poisoned by his fourth wife, Agrippina, to ensure the passing of the title to her son and his adoptive son, Nero, at the expense of Britannicus, Claudius's son from a previous marriage. Agrippina has been described by many historians as ambitious, violent, and ruthless, and there is some truth probably to it. She was also described as very beautiful, so she became a stereotype of the overtly ambitious and immoral femme fatale, in a sense. In any case, she ended up executed by her own son, Nero, 5 years after his accession. Nero's reign lasted for 15 years, and he is one of the most famous Roman emperors, even though not for the right reasons. We cannot exactly know to what extent, but she certainly intended to at least share power with him or even control him. But he solved this little mommy issues by ordering her stabbing to death. Nero did a lot to develop cultural infrastructure in Rome. There was a giant fire in Rome in 64 AD, and this was convenient for his building projects. So he has always been suspected of being responsible for it. And the legend of Nero playing the harp or enjoying the show while Rome was burning appeared. It is most certainly untrue, but there is no proof of this anyway. But it is true that Nero was not perfectly sane. He believed to be a god and a genius artist, and he ordered the construction of the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It was a giant palace with landscaped gardens that needed a lot of space in the heart of Rome. It was built, but it was an embarrassment to his successors. So bit by bit they used the site to build new things, baths, an amphitheater, a temple to Venus. Within 40 years, Nero's palace had been stripped of its precious materials and had disappeared under new constructions. Nero's reign also saw a victorious war in the east against the Parthian Empire and the repression of the revolt led by Boudica in the province of Britannia. But Nero turned hugely unpopular, and he was ousted by a military coup. He committed suicide or was executed discreetly while at the hands of the Senate. Now, another aspect of Nero's rule was the beginning of persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, which started with the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. This persecution lasted for over 2 centuries. until 313 AD, when the Christian religion was finally legalized. Why and how did this happen? As I told you in the first part of this story, a plurality of religions existed in Rome and in the provinces. The Romans accepted perfectly the coexistence of their gods with other pantheons and cults. But this tolerance had its limitations, because religion and social order, or religion and state, were not entirely distinguished. Participating in religious ceremonies and publicly showing your respect to gods was a way of stating your belonging to Roman society and support of social order. Before Christians, there were already cases of small-scale persecutions against cults that did not fit with these rules, when they were seen as superstitio, superstition. Superstition to the Romans had a very dangerous connotation, much more serious than the current meaning of the word superstition. To them, superstitio was a set of religious beliefs and practices that were not only different, but a threat to society. These cults were believed to turn people away from harmony and to turn them almost mad. On these grounds, some cults were persecuted throughout Roman history. For example, participants in the cult of Bacchus were executed in the 2nd century BC, long before Christianity, for their excesses. Later, similar measures were taken against Druids in the provinces with Celtic heritage. For the same reason, because they refused to participate in Roman ceremonies, there was a suspicion of the Jews. The Jews were never officially persecuted because at least their religion was ancient, and the Romans saw the honoring of one's ancestral tradition as the right thing to do. Some Romans despised Jewish religion that they regarded as a dangerous cult. But overall, they were left free to practice their religion. A special tax, the Jewish tax, was created, so there was a form of discrimination, but it never turned into widespread violence. When Christianity appeared, so that was still very recent in the 1st century AD, it was initially perceived as a sect within Judaism because of where it happened, and because the first followers of the new religion were Jewish. But soon a distinction appeared, with the conversions and the first Christians refusing to pay the Jewish tax, and Christianity fell quite well into the category of superstitio for most Romans. It rejected traditional gods as fake, implied the refusal to participate in ceremonies. It preached equal dignity between all men, when Roman social order was based on social class and birthrights. So it was seen as a sect that could be corrosive to society. And because the Christians were at best frowned upon, they went into hiding and met at night in a private environment. Whereas Roman religion was intended to be public and visible, so this added another layer of suspicion. So initially, much of Roman rejection of Christianity was based on the perception that it was bad for social order, and contrary to Judaism, that at least had the benefit of being a venerable ancient religion. Christianity was based on the following of Jesus Christ, who had died a few decades before, and in Roman view, as a convicted criminal. Nero was the first emperor to try and put the blame on Christians for the difficulties of his reign. But he knew that would be easy because hostility towards them was already widespread. Then, for a very long time, until the mid-3rd century, so that is almost 200 years later, the Roman state stayed out of it, but regularly Christianity was forbidden in particular provinces. Mobs would form against Christians, and local authorities turned a blind eye, or even encouraged it as a way to keep the populace happy. Persecutions took a much broader dimension in the 3rd century, and in a sense it came with a relative weakness of the empire. It is not uncommon to see a population or authorities turn against the minority when a feeling of insecurity dominates. In 250 AD, the Emperor Decius issued a decree requiring public sacrifice to the gods, which in fact was a sort of testimonial of allegiance to the emperor and to the established order, like a loyalty oath. All citizens refusing this, even when given the opportunity to offer sacrifice, were arrested, tortured, and executed. And in practice, this meant mainly Christians. This really started a systemic persecution, which culminated at the end of the 3rd century and the beginning of the 4th. At this point, Christian communities had multiplied, and in some parts of the empire they lived more or less visibly. The systematic persecution by the state split these communities between those who accepted to show signs of submission to save their lives and the diehards who refused, some of them accepting martyrdom. In the first centuries, the Catholic Church beatified various of them who died for their refusal to abdicate their faith. Some of them, that's the most visible and famous aspect of this martyrdom, died in public games, where their execution was turned into entertainment for the crowds. There was a dramatic reversal at the beginning of the 4th century. Christianity had made its way to governing circles, and it was legalized, and then the emperors converted to it, and later made Christianity the empire's official religion. Appearing within the Roman Empire had a huge impact on Christianity. Persecution for a long time shaped it, having the center of Catholicism in Rome and the Orthodox Patriarchate in Constantinople for a long time, spreading to the whole Mediterranean world. All of these are products of the development of Christianity within the empire. But we were with the fall of Nero. Long before this happened, Nero died with no heir, putting an end to the Julio-Claudian dynasty. There was a short civil war in 68 and 69, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, because several of them quickly arose and fell until the accession of Vespasian, the first ruler of the Flavian dynasty. It is Vespasian who began the construction of the Colosseum in Rome, and he remained in power for 10 years. He was succeeded by Titus for 2 years. It is during Titus's reign that the Herculaneum and Pompey disasters happened. The Vesuvius, the volcano, started an eruption that buried the 2 cities and their inhabitants and their ashes. Then there was Domitian, who returned to the kind of paranoia that Tiberius had shown decades before. He was assassinated in 96. At this point, after several emperors over more than a century, it was hard to defend the value of the imperial system. The majority of emperors had proven incapable, paranoid, or unfit for their charge. But Rome resisted these useless emperors because its administration was sound, with functioning laws, loyalty to Rome, and loyalty not just to Rome as a state or to an emperor, but more broadly to Rome as a concept. Rome had a long history already. It brought progress, technicality, and the Romans had no doubt their order was superior to anything else. And their perception was vindicated in the following century that can be seen as a golden age of the Roman Empire, the 2nd century. 5 consecutive emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius, and Marcus Aurelius, ruled over a much quieter period, with peaceful transitions between them and the prosperous empire. The empire reached its maximal extension under Trajan in the 2nd century. After that, there were still conquests, but other provinces were lost. Interestingly, it is under Marcus Aurelius that an embassy, or maybe a group of Roman merchants, arrived in China. The phrase Pax Romana applies very well to the 2nd century, because even though there were wars on the frontiers and occasional revolts, overall order was maintained, and political life was somewhat quieter in Rome. Transitions between emperors may have been helped by the fact that until Marcus Aurelius, none of them had a biological heir. The title was transmitted by filiation. Each emperor selected and then adopted his successor. But Marcus Aurelius had a son, the future Emperor Commodus. And many historians date the beginning of Rome's decline to Commodus's reign. If you are wondering, this is the same Commodus that appears in the movie Gladiator. The emperor he assassinates at the beginning would be Marcus Aurelius. And like in the film, Commodus was mad indeed, but he stayed in power for 12 years until a plot led to his assassination in 192 AD. After Commodus's death followed a period of unrest, and various pretenders appeared. The one that finally won after a civil war was Septimus Severus. He was supported by parts of the army and defeated his last opponent in 197 at the Battle of Lugdunum. It was the name of the city of Lyon in France. There was a period of respite with various emperors from the dynasty founded by Severus, but the empire entered a severe crisis for 50 years, from the 230s. It is called the crisis of the 3rd century. Political instability and the violent death of emperors had returned. In 235, Alexander Severus was murdered by his own troops, and the empire was hit by pressures from the outside that it failed to contain. Germanic tribes raiding across the borders, the Sassanid Empire in the east, which was a successful revival of the Persian Empire that succeeded the Parthian Empire, and on top of this, in 251, a large epidemic called the Plague of Cyprian began. It may have been smallpox, and it caused high mortality and disorganized the whole empire. The situation was so out of control that in 258, the empire broke up into 3 states, one with Western Europe, Britannia, Gaul, and Hispania, one on the east with Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, and what remained in the middle. It took 16 years and 2 emperors to restore the empire, defeat barbarians, and the revolted provinces to reform it. It was achieved under the Emperor Aurelian in 274. Aurelian can be credited for restoring, even saving the empire, but irreparable damage had been done, especially in the western part. Cities had been destroyed and the economic system broken. It never came back to what it was before. At this point, by the end of the 3rd century, a restoration under Emperor Diocletian took place, but it would never be the same again. The empire was not bigger than 2 centuries before, but provinces had gained more independence. And with the 3rd century, the imperial system had proven not much better than the late republic at avoiding civil wars. Diocletian also understood that the empire had become ungovernable by a single emperor because of the size and the existence of threats on 2 main fronts, one in the north against barbarians, mainly Germanic tribes, and one in the east against the Sassanids. So he started a process of splitting the empire into 2 parts for administrative reasons, with 2 equal emperors. And a few years later, in each half of the empire, a secondary ruler, like a junior emperor, was chosen by them to head half of their domains. So in practice, it was a tetrarchy, 4 rulers, each with a quarter of the empire, and making sure the transition between them was smooth. The secondary rulers who received the title of Caesar were as the emperors became Augustus and had to name a new Caesar and so on. These reforms saved the empire. It was on the brink of collapse, and by the beginning of the 4th century, Diocletian had stabilized it. But the tetrarchy was short-lived, and after Diocletian disappeared, pretenders multiplied. It is also under Diocletian that persecution against Christians reached their peak, and Christianity was made legal shortly after, in 315, under Emperor Constantine, who unified the empire under his control. The Roman Empire resisted for the better part of the 4th century, despite more succession crises, but pressure from the so-called barbarians increased. Many of their tribes were actually fleeing their lands following an invasion by the Huns. Along the 4th century, the empire oscillated between partitioning and reuniting. The last emperor to rule over the whole empire was Theodosius, who died in 395 AD. He made Christianity the official religion. His 2 sons inherited half of the empire each, and the western part declined progressively and even disaggregated over the 5th century. The threat of raids made the emperors move the Western Empire's capital to Ravenna, north of Rome, for defensive reasons. It sounds odd because the threat of barbarian tribes came from the north, but Ravenna had a good defensive position. It was surrounded by swamps and marshes, and it was also closer to the eastern half of the empire. It didn't stop Ravenna from falling later. Actually, in the 5th century, the Western Empire was unable to defend itself or absorb the waves of invaders or Germanic tribes fleeing other invaders, such as the Huns. It withdrew from faraway provinces like Britannia and tried to defend Italy, Gaul, and Spain. But after decades of decline and losses of territory, the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 by a Germanic warlord who crowned himself king of Italy. 476 is the generally agreed date of the end of the Western Roman Empire, but it doesn't mean everything disappeared overnight in Italy. The Roman Senate continued to exist for a bit more time and supported this new king, but the empire was definitely lost. It was not the end of the story of the Roman Empire either, because the eastern part, later renamed Byzantium, kept existing for almost 1,000 years more, and even flourished in the centuries following the fall of Italy, reconquering parts of the Western Empire. But this is another story, and I will stop here with the disappearance of the Western Empire. The loss of Roman dominance in Western Europe plunged these regions in Wales. Fragmentation. The economy receded and did not return to where it was for centuries. The disappearance of the Roman Empire in Europe and the waves of invaders who created their own kingdoms started the long and erratic process of formation of European kingdoms that later became countries and nations. After a millennium of expansion, Rome was no more. The city of Rome itself declined dramatically, and maybe it could have disappeared if it had not become the center of Christianity. The population fell from 1 million in the golden age of the 2nd century to a few thousand, and yet the history of the city was far from over, since it resurrected economically and culturally another millennium later, becoming this incredible place where the ruins of ancient Rome stand near the most extravagant palaces and churches from the Renaissance and Baroque times. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep, or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.